Dawson didn't want to give me up. Difficult faith. There's a lot of aspects of our Christian faith and our life here on earth that are absolutely joyful, that are absolutely amazing. But those same amazing things, those same enjoyable things, can also be the very things that make our faith difficult. Think about the wonderful, joyful relationship of parents to their children. Amazing, godly relationship. But when one of the members or multiple members in that relationship don't fear God, don't love God, that can create pain. There are plenty of examples that we could probably all point at of situations where a child becomes a Christian and their parents aren't Christians. And suddenly there's tension in the relationship. And those parents, maybe they're of a different religious group or religious affiliation. And they start to ridicule and cause pain to that child. Or you flip that relationship. The parents become Christians and the children are not. And the children start to ridicule their parents and pull them away from the faith, or try to pull them away from the faith. Or take the joyous relationship between a man and a woman. That romantic relationship that is so joyful. But then, again, when one of the members in that relationship is not a Christian, is maybe antagonistic towards Christianity, it makes faith difficult. And again, we've all seen these situations. A Christian who's not yet married starts dating a non-Christian, and they fall in love, and the Christian sadly falls away rather than the non-Christian becoming a Christian. Or a couple, they're already married and they're not Christians, and one of them becomes a Christian, but the other one causes them problems, causes them troubles. A joyous thing turned difficult. And we could go on and on with this list. We could talk about money. We could talk about entertainment. We could talk about any number of things. Sometimes our faith is difficult. And that's hard. We say that. But when rubber meets the road, when it gets down to brass tacks, as the saying is, and we're the ones who are faced with this tough, difficult situation, that's when faith, it's really tested. Jesus speaks about this, and he speaks about it in exceedingly blunt terms. Tonight we're going to be looking at Luke 14, and in this, Jesus gives us a discussion about counting the cost. Most of us are familiar with this passage, and in this, we're going to look at the fact that we need to consider what we love more. We're then going to see that we need to consider the cost of faith. And then finally, we're going to see that we need to consider what we're willing to sacrifice for the faith. Now, considering that we have here, as it were, the congregational cream of the crop, right? We have the people that are here all the time. We have people, I think everybody but the children in the room are all teachers in some capacity. So we are people who know these things. But we're also the ones that we're going to face these hard times. We're going to face difficult situations where we have to decide what's more important. My faith or something else? Let's read. Let's look at Jesus' discussion about considering what you love more. Luke 14, 25 through 27. And we read, "Now large crowds were going along with him. And he turned and he said to them, 'If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple.'" What a blunt thing to say. Going by today's standards of, making friends and influencing people, this is the wrong thing to say. But Jesus is being very blunt about what following him is going to be about. He says, if anyone does not hate his own father and mother. Now, many people in the world, they point at that and they say, well, see, Christianity is a religion of hate. Now, what we know Jesus is doing here is he's using a bit of hyperbole to drive home the idea of what do you love more? Do you love God more or do you love your family more? And we see this illustrated in Matthew 10, or not illustrated, but explained further in Matthew 10, 34 through 39, where Jesus says, "Do not think that I came to bring peace on the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I came to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's enemies will be the members of his household. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he who does not take up his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. He who has found his life will lose it, and he who has lost his life for my sake will find it." There we see this teaching explained. What do you love more? He's not saying that we need to be hateful and mean and antagonistic towards our family. He's saying, what do you love more? Me or your family? Now let's dig into this a little bit. Let's spend some time with this, because each of these different groups of people he talks about present different challenges. He says over in Luke 14:26, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother. Okay, we know that we're supposed to care for our father and mother. We're supposed to honor and respect them. But this can be a difficult point. You know, think about the first century Christians. They're going out of Judaism, the religion of their forefathers, and they're following this Christ. Well, many of them would be disowned. Many of them would be kicked out of their households, and their parents would no longer recognize them as their children. And so, by following Christ, they're going to have to forsake mother and father. They still have to respect them, still have to love them, but who do you love more? And many of us, many of the people in this room are first-generation Christians, and we've experienced this, where our parents have a different faith than we do. And so we have to decide, am I going to follow what my family has done? Or am I going to follow what the Bible says? But then he says something that I think is even harder than that. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children, right there, that's even harder. A spouse. I am blessed to have a good Christian wife. But it's something to think about. If something happened and there was a situation where I had to choose between my wife and following Christ, what would I choose? And none of us want to think about that, right? We all want to think, hey, that's not going to happen. But that choice has been put before some people. Whether it be because someone who was previously sound goes off their rocker and leaves God, or whether it's because somebody is not yet married and they want to find a spouse, but there's no Christians around, and so they look among those who are not Christians. Now, I'm living proof that it is possible for someone to date a non-Christian and they become a Christian. But this question is one that's at the heart of it. Who do you love more? God or this person? Going on the bunny trail just a little bit of the non-married. One of the things that brought Keely and I to where we are now is that she would not budge on her devotion to God. She said, well, if you want to be around me on Sundays or Wednesdays, you're going to be at the church building because that's where I'm going to be. She would say, no, I'm not going to go hang out with you late at night on Saturdays because I got to teach Bible class in the morning. And so I knew if I wanted to be around her, I was going to have to pick up this whole serious about the faith thing. But we have plenty of examples. Plenty of examples of people who didn't do that. People who said, okay, well, I'll meet you halfway. I'll not go on Sunday morning so I can spend time with you. Or I'll compromise on my morals so I can be with you. And what happens? Well, the non-Christian wins out. It becomes a question of who do you love more? God or this person? He then goes on and he talks about brothers and sisters. We all love our siblings, but sometimes siblings can be the most antagonistic people in the world. Sometimes our siblings are the ones who, they mean so much to us, and they know where to get us to get our goat. But we don't want to lose them. They're our siblings. And there are examples we could point at people that they forsake the faith to keep peace with their siblings. And so we have to ask ourselves, who do we love more? God or our siblings? But then Jesus says, probably the largest thing here. Yes, and even his own life. He cannot be my disciple. Okay, Jesus is not saying that we need to be like self-loathing people who hate ourselves. But the Christian life is one of putting him first. And to be entirely honest, of all the things on this list, self is probably the one that causes the most people to leave Christ. Because we're selfish. And there's some sin, some pleasure, something that we love more than God. And it comes down to self, putting self in the place of God. But we have to look at ourselves. And we have to say, okay, do I really love God more than I love myself? Keely was telling me about something that she read, or she was listening to an interview or something. And the person made the point that we are supposed to be living different than the world. We're supposed to have Jesus as our all, as our highest goal. But ask yourself, if I were to forsake that and decide that hedonism, self-pleasure, was that my highest goal, how much would my life actually change? Many Christians live a life of self-indulgence, and so if they made that decision, their life wouldn't really change. They'd just change where they were sitting on Sunday mornings. And so we have to ask ourselves, do I really sacrifice self for him? Do I really love him more than I love myself? And to be honest, this is a question that hits at me too. You know, are there areas where I need to put him first rather than myself? He says, if anyone doesn't come to me, or if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and his own brother and sister, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. Okay, we talked about this. Carry your cross. And many people in the religious world take this to mean that you're going to have some hardship that you have to bear. But you think about what he's saying in this section. He's talking about sacrifice. What are you going to sacrifice? What are you willing to sacrifice to follow him? And when we talk about the phrasing in the first century of take up your cross, okay, this isn't just like something difficult that you have to deal with, you know, my difficulty, I got to press through. This is, I'm taking up the implement to kill myself. Not me kill myself, but the implement on which I am going to die. This is giving up my life. He's saying, are you willing to go to the grave to follow me, to give up absolutely everything to follow me. And for many American Christians, that's not something they're willing to do. Give up our comforts, our personal freedoms, our First, Second, Third, Fourth, Fifth Amendment rights, our comfy couches, our 52-inch plasma screen TVs, our nice cars that we love oh so much, our nice motorcycles that we love so much. Are we willing to sacrifice it all to follow him? And then he goes on, and he has this conversation about considering the cost of faith. And this is something we talk about with new Christians a lot, but it's something for us older Christians, our more mature Christians, to think about as well. He says, starting in verse 28, "For which one of you, when he wants to build a tower, does not first sit down and calculate the cost to see if he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid the foundation and is not able to finish it, all who observe it begin to ridicule him, saying, 'This man began to build and was not able to finish.'" So he uses the analogy of building a tower. So if you're building a house, building a building, you look at if you can afford it. We've all seen half-finished houses sitting in neighborhoods, and someone ran out of money, right? They didn't consider the cost, or the rising cost of lumber made it so they couldn't finish it. How sad would that be for that to be our faith? A half-built faith, starting on that path of maturity, starting on that journey, and then abandoning it. Because whatever. We met a non-Christian who we fell in love with and left the church. We had a difficulty with parents and decided that the strife between our family was not worth the staying faithful, or whatever it may be. And then he uses a second analogy. Kings going to war. He says, "Or what king, when he sets out to meet another king in battle, does not first sit down and consider whether he is strong enough with 10,000 men to encounter the one coming against him with 20,000? Or else, while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace." So, a king going to battle needs to consider the battlefield, consider whether he can win. Now, we're not literally taking a sword into war, but we are in a spiritual battle. And we face spiritual struggles, spiritual battles, day in and day out. The thing about it, though, is that we can't win on our own. We can't defeat the enemy on our own might. We need God, like we talked about this morning in my sermon. We need God. He has the power. He has the wisdom. So we have to stop and we have to think, okay, am I really ready to do this? Am I really mentally prepared for this battle? This is especially poignant for second-generation Christians or third-generation Christians who they've only ever known the Christian life and haven't really been in that situation where they had to forsake an old lifestyle and change to conform to Christ. And so when that second or third generation Christian suddenly is faced with a battle they've never faced before, they're asked that question. And so those who are second or third generation Christians have to ask themselves, have I really considered the cost that I am signing up for? Now, I am not advocating abandoning God and running away if you're not up to it. I'm saying we need to prepare ourselves. As Paul says, put on the armor of God. Prepare ourselves for battle. Be sober-minded because we are in a battle. Especially those of us who are fully dedicated to this work. Because we're the ones that Satan will try to corrupt. If he can knock one of the stalwart members of the congregation out of the congregation, if he can corrupt the reputation of one of the leading members of the congregation. He could ruin the faith of many of the weaker members. And so we, as the members of the congregation who are always here, we have to consider that cost and not let our guard down. That brings us to the final point that Jesus makes here, and that is that we need to consider what we are willing to sacrifice. He says, verse 33 and following, "So then, none of you can be my disciple who does not give up all his own possessions. Therefore, salt is good. But if even salt has become tasteless, with what will it be seasoned? It is useless either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown out. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear." He makes another really hard-hitting statement. "So then, none of you can be my disciple who does not give up all his own possessions." Now, is Jesus here advocating that we need to all get rid of everything and go live in poverty in a cardboard box on the side of the road? No. But this is a discussion of what we're willing to give up, what we're willing to sacrifice. You know, if it comes down to it, and we're faced with true persecution, where we're going to lose everything. You know, denounce the name of Christ or be thrown into prison and all your goods be confiscated. What are we going to choose? If we're faced with, you are going to lose your job unless you renounce your stance on LGBTQ. If we're faced with, you're going to lose your tax-exempt status as a congregation unless you change your beliefs about transgenderism. What are we willing to sacrifice? Are we really willing to give those things up? It's easy to rage, right? It's easy to say, oh, it's horrible that they would do this. Rah, 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 rah. But when it comes down to it, are we willing to sacrifice? He says, therefore, salt is good. What does salt do? Well, it flavors, right? It seasons. It preserves. We have that discussion when we talk about the salt of the earth. We are the salt of the earth. But if salt becomes tasteless, it becomes the same as the things it's mixed with. No longer flavoring, no longer preserving. That's like a Christian who becomes just like the world, just as materialistic, just as hedonistic. What good is it? With what is it to be seasoned? He says it's useless, either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown out. I fear that many Christians have become the same as the world. And I'm not saying this in a judgmental, you all are bad and I'm not kind of way, because this is a struggle I face too. And there's a lot of fun things in the world. But we have to look at ourselves and say, okay, have I become just the same as the world that I'm supposed to be apart from? Am I really willing to give it all for Christ? There's a song, and the rest of the song isn't necessarily the greatest song in the world, but in it he says something to the tune of, we all say we'd take a bullet for somebody. It's easy to say you'd die for someone. It's harder to say that you'd live for them. And for a secular song, it's a pretty good message right there. It's easy to say, oh yeah, if someone was going to come and say that I'm going to shoot you unless you denounce Christ, I'm going to do that. I'm going to say that I love Christ and die. That's easy enough to say because it's done. It's over. You get to go be with God. It's harder to say, yeah, I'm going to give up all my comfy little liberties to stay faithful to God, to stay on His side. When we look at the religious world around us, the church is in the state that it is for this very reason. Christians are unwilling to give up their comforts for Christ. And so they compromise on marriage, divorce for marriage. They compromise on LGBTQ plus topics. They compromise on the oneness of the church. They compromise on worship. They compromise on all these little things to keep the comforts of relationship, of status, of whatever. And so then we end up with places that have Church of Christ on the sign, but for all intents and purposes, they're community churches or even Unitarian churches. Let that not be us. Tonight we have the people that are always here. And let's be the ones. Let's be the ones who demonstrate the principle Jesus is talking about here to the rest of the congregation. Let's be the ones who are examples to the brethren in faith, love, and purity, as Paul tells Timothy. Let's be the ones that show the rest of the congregation this is what it is to be dedicated to God. Because those who are in this room are leaders, are influencers, are people who have others who look up to them. And we can make a huge difference in our congregation. I care for all of you, and I thank you all for everything you do for the congregation and for my family. And so if anybody has a need, you all are familiar with the invitation. If you have a need, please let it be known as Patrick leads us in this invitation song.